In We Who Wrestle with God, Peterson walks us through various stories from the Bible with special emphasis on the first 5 books of the Old Testament, with the intent of drawing from them a specific characterization of God, a specific characterization of the divine. Essentially, this is a book about how to think about God. The subtitle of the book, after all, is Perceptions of the Divine. This is essentially what Peterson is up to. He's using the biblical text as a vehicle to present his own idiosyncratic representation of the divine. In the introduction to the book, which we'll look at shortly in more detail, he tells us that he's going to present, quote, a much more psychological and relational definition of the supreme deity, detaching God from the pagan theater of the natural world and placing him wonderfully and terribly inside us all, end quote. As this quote indicates, Peterson's perception of God is going to end up being markedly different from, and I would argue at odds with, the traditional historical understanding of God. And this is something that we'll have occasion to point out along the way in this series. To draw out his particular perception of the divine from the biblical text, Peterson will apply his own ideological hermeneutic to the text. In other words, he's going to understand and interpret the various biblical accounts from the perspective of a particular ideological framework. It's a framework that will allow him to deliver the perception of the divine that he's looking for. Now, the trouble here is that Peterson just isn't transparent about his hermeneutical project. He doesn't, in any clear or plain way, tell you what he's doing. He just starts doing it. So if you're going to understand what's going on in this book, it's absolutely critical, it seems to me, that you have to have some awareness of the ideology that's controlling Peterson's interpretation of these biblical accounts. Now, it seems abundantly evident to me that the controlling ideology at work in this book is that of analytical psychology, also sometimes referred to as Jungian analysis, after its founder, Carl Jung. Jung was a highly influential 20th century psychologist who studied for a time with Sigmund Freud, although his own thought ends up differing from Freud's in significant ways. Now, I'm not saying that analytical psychology is the only influence on Peterson in this book, but I think, as I say, it's definitely the controlling influence. So let me just take a few minutes here to unpack some of the key Jungian ideas that I think are playing a critical hermeneutical role in Peterson's book. Now, one of the ways that Jung differed from Sigmund Freud and from Friedrich Nietzsche, by the way, who he was also greatly influenced by, is that Jung believed in the existence of universal and objective human values and meaning. But unlike the Christian view, which, by the way, Christianity was another major influence on Jung's thinking. Unlike the Christian view, which ultimately grounds objective and universal values in God, Jung grounded them in the deep structure of human consciousness, or in what he called the psyche. So by means of this psyche, which is universal to all humans, we're able to construct a hierarchy of values by which we can morally order and orient our lives. Now, by this term psyche, you meant something like the entirety of all mental and brain processes. So the psyche includes the conscious aspect of our mental experience, but importantly, it also includes the unconscious aspect of our mental life as well. So the psyche is the whole of a person's mental experience, both conscious and unconscious. Now, when Peterson deploys this term in his book, and he uses this term everywhere, it's important to understand that he has this Jungian meaning of the word psyche in mind. And according to Jung, within every individual human psyche, there is what he called the collective unconscious. The collective unconscious is a part of the human psyche, the unconscious part, that contains universal patterns of thought and behavior that are shared by all humans. And these universal patterns of thought and behavior in the unconscious part of the psyche have been passed down to us through our ancestral lineage. And you can think of this collective unconscious as something like an inherited set of pre-existent forms or structures of consciousness that exist deep within that unconscious part of our human psyches, and which are universally shared across all individuals of the human species and across all cultures and across all times. And Jung believed that these universal patterns of thought and behavior have existed in the human psyche from the beginning, from the very moment that humans became a differentiated species in the deep past. This Jungian idea that there are these deep evolutionary primitive layers and structures underlying our conscious awareness is something that Peterson clearly endorses. Now, Jung also believed that as individual human beings, we are all striving for psychological balance and growth by integrating different parts of our psyche with one another. So for Jung, the psyche is a kind of a self-regulating system that is constantly seeking balance, constantly seeking fulfillment and wholeness between opposing forces at work with within our own consciousness. And Jung believed that each one of us are on a kind of individual journey, a journey of transformation in life. And we're striving to become whole, to become integrated persons in a process that he called individuation. Jung believed that this journey that we're all on is in some sense spiritual, and that the expression of this journey is at the mystical heart of all religions. So religion for Jung is fundamentally, and I would say this is true for Peterson too, fundamentally a practical road to individuation. Religion is a means to psychological wholeness and fulfillment for both the individual person and for a society made up of individual persons. In fact, let me say this. I'm convinced that this idea of wrestling with God in the mind of Peterson is ultimately meant to signal this Jungian struggle for individuation, the struggle for psychological wholeness and integration and fulfillment within the individual consciousness, but also within society at large. Okay, we're almost there. There is one more very important element of Jung's and Peterson's thought that we need to be aware of, and that is the idea of the archetype. Jung believed that human beings have the unique ability to express the underlying structures of the collective unconscious through symbolic representation, manifested primarily in human drama or in story. And Jung calls these symbolic representations of the deep universal psyche archetypes. And the idea here is that from the beginning of the human species, there have been recurring motifs and themes or archetypes that have been expressed in every generation and in every culture through the vehicle of drama and story, and especially in religious and mythological drama and story in literature. And some of these alleged archetypes have been identified and even given names. So, for example, we see some of these being mentioned by Peterson himself in this book later in chapter 1. We see him refer to the archetypes of, for example, the dragon of chaos, or the great mother, or the great father, and so on. These are Jungian archetypes. Now, for Jung and for Peterson, these archetypes are very important because, as I said, they are expressions of the very source of objective meaning and value for us as a species. Remember, for Jung, it's the psyche that is the source of objective meaning and value. And in his book, Peterson at one point even says that our conscience is eternally attempting to reveal truth to us, and that the echoes of this revelation of conscience are heard most fundamentally in the drama of Scripture, in the drama of the Bible, which is why Peterson is so interested in Scripture. So archetypes, then, are critical for Jung and for Peterson in the striving for and in the journey of individuation, for the pursuit of psychological and societal wholeness and fulfillment. And Jung thought that there's tremendous benefit for us as individuals and for society as a whole to study the great dramas, especially the religious ones. And for Peterson, this is especially true of the biblical drama, of the biblical stories. We do this so as to bring those aspects of the collective unconscious or the deep psyche to bear on our conscious awareness. And to the degree that we can be consciously aware of these deep patterns of thought and behavior, to that degree can we consciously and willfully align our lives with them and live according to them, and thereby achieve an integrated and whole state of consciousness, both individually and again as a society. In preparation for this series, I went back and actually listened to Peterson's lecture that he did on Carl Jung from 2015, and listened to how Peterson himself, in his own words, describes what Jung was up to. And I quote, "What Jung was really trying to do was to resurrect deep religious representations from the dead, so to speak, and make them conscious so people could align themselves with them again," end quote. Now this, I submit, is exactly what Peterson is doing in We Who Wrestle with God. In my opinion, he's continuing this Jungian project by mining the biblical text for archetypes of the collective unconscious, so that he can place before our conscious awareness a perception of the divine that is within us, so that we can align ourselves with it and achieve psychological and societal wholeness and fulfillment. All right. So that's my long-winded critical summary of what I think is basically going on in this book and the background ideological framework that is controlling Peterson's interpretation of Scripture. And I'm not saying that this is the only thing that's happening in this book, but it seems to me to be the main thing.